children experience parental incarceration. So this figure here shows the cumulative risk of parental incarceration by age 17 by race and ethnicity. And so I want to draw your attention to two things. So first, sort of for each successive birth cohort, the risk of incarceration has increased for all race and ethnic groups. Right? And second, the risk of incarceration, parental incarceration that is has increased for everybody, but especially among non-Hispanic Black children. Right? So for the most recent birth cohort, about 1/4 of Black children, 11% of Hispanic children, and 4% of white children will experience parental incarceration by age 17. And this figure here shows that the inequalities in the risk of parental incarceration also vary by parental education, right? Sort of a marker of socioeconomic status. So children who have parents with less than a high school diploma are at a higher risk of experiencing parental incarceration than children of parents with high school diplomas or some college. And so among this group of those children with parents who have less than a high school diploma, more than 60% of Black children will experience parental incarceration by the age of 17. Right? So taken together, these figures that I'm showing you here really show that exposure to parental incarceration is really concentrated among minority and poor children. So I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your head as sort of I'm going through the rest of the talk, and I'll come back to it later. So in response to these rising incarceration rates and sort of the unequal distribution of experiencing parental incarceration, there's been a growing literature on the intergenerational consequences of incarceration. So by intergenerational consequences, I mean sort of what are the effects of incarceration on the children of the incarcerated. So we know from this literature that paternal incarceration in particular, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, paternal incarceration, not maternal incarceration, though I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. We know that paternal incarceration has deleterious consequences for children's behavioral outcomes, their educational outcomes, and their health outcomes. We know that these associations persist above and beyond factors that are associated with paternal incarceration. So we know that these associations persist above and beyond, adjusting for race and ethnicity or poverty or father's criminal activity or substance abuse or things like that, right? All of the things that are related to sort of experiencing paternal incarceration in the first place. And we know that incarceration is a mechanism of stratification in the United States, right? So we know that because poor and minority children are more likely to be exposed to parental incarceration than their counterparts, we know then that sort of creates disadvantages and inequalities that persist across generations. So theoretically, there are a lot of reasons to expect why paternal incarceration may lead to deleterious outcomes for children. So we know that on average, paternal incarceration reduces family income and increases economic hardship. Right? It's expensive to be incarcerated. It's expensive to be connected to somebody who's incarcerated. We know that paternal incarceration puts strains on the parental relationship. It's really not only costly, but sort of difficult, sort of practically and emotionally, to maintain ties with a partner who's incarcerated. We know that we know that incarceration is associated with relationship dissolution among couples and reduced relationship quality among those who stay together. We know that paternal incarceration impairs both mothers' and fathers' parenting by removing the father, of course, but also creating stress that affects the mother's parenting. And we know that paternal incarceration impairs mental health. So it increases mental health problems, both among the incarcerated and among those who are connected to them. It's really stressful, essentially, to be incarcerated, and it's really stressful to be connected to somebody who's incarcerated. And so all of these factors, the reductions in family income, the strains on the parental relationship, impairments in parenting and mental health, we all know that those are associated with children's well-being, right? So these might all be pathways through which incarceration affects children. And so that's what we do know, right? We know that. And so I'm going to tell you today about some things we don't know, and some sort of gaps in the literature that this paper that I'm talking about today is trying to address. So the existing research on this topic generally asks one really important question, right? So the question is always, does paternal incarceration affect children's well-being? Well, there's been a lot of attention to this question. It's a really important question, and it's certainly, we need to know the answer to that question before being able to, address other questions. But today I want to tell you a little bit about something that we don't know, which is essentially that children have different risks of exposure to paternal incarceration. We know that. So not all kids are similarly likely to experience the incarceration of a father. And that these different risks that children experience might translate into different responses. So essentially the children's background characteristics and things about their family life might condition their responses to paternal incarceration, right? So essentially, paternal incarceration may not be bad for everybody, or it may not be as bad for everybody, right? Does that make sense? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to look at essentially for which kids are most affected by paternal incarceration, because that might be an important policy lever in terms of thinking of, if we know who's most affected, where can we divert resources? And if we know why they're most affected, or why some kids aren't affected, what kind of other resources do they need to sort of help them? So essentially, I'm going to look at variation in the association between paternal incarceration and children's outcomes by children's risk of paternal incarceration. I'll talk more about that in a second. So there's sort of two competing hypotheses here. The first is that the relationship between paternal incarceration and children's outcomes might be strongest among children who are least likely to experience paternal incarceration. So children who are least likely to experience paternal incarceration are generally children who have sort of advantaged family lives, or relatively advantaged family lives. They they have stable home environments on average. They may be shielded from severe economic deprivation. They may live in more advantaged neighborhoods. And for these kids, the incarceration of a father may be what I'm calling, and this is sort of borrowing from sociology of mental health literature, may be an event stressor. So an unanticipated or unexpected life event. And we know that unanticipated things and unexpected life events are really stressful, right? And can cause a lot of stress to one's well-being. So for these children who are sort of unlikely to experience paternal incarceration, it may be that this incarceration is sort of an unanticipated shock, right? That has really large deleterious implications. On the other hand, it's possible that the relationship between paternal incarceration and children's well-being may be strongest among those children who are most likely to experience paternal incarceration. So we know that incarceration is not something, we know that it's often correlated with lots of other things going on, right? And that it may be a chronic stressor. And it might, so a chronic stressor is sort of an indicator of cumulative disadvantage that can really, we know that chronic stressors have deleterious consequences for children's well-being. And so I'm going to kind of try to adjudicate between these two sort of perspectives here. I'm going to use data from the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study. And so this is a birth cohort of children. So children were born around the turn of the century. They were born, it's an urban sample, so that's really important to keep in mind for the results. It's an urban sample, and these children were born to mostly unmarried parents in urban areas in 1998 and 1999. It's a longitudinal survey, so the kids the kids and their parents have been followed. They're 15 now. We have data through age 15. I'm not going to talk about that because that just came out. So, but they've been followed for 15 years. It's a broadly representative and population-based sample, and because it's an urban sample of children born to mostly unmarried parents, it's a disadvantaged sample. And because of that, there's relatively high rates of exposure to paternal incarceration. So about a third of children in the sample experience the incarceration of their father by the time they're 9 years old. So a third of them. So I'm going to use data from 5 waves of the survey. So at baseline, when kids were born, when kids were 1-year-old, 3-year-old, 5-year-old, and 9 years old. And I'm going to measure children's well-being when they're 9 years old. And so the measures of children's well-being are going to be two behavioral outcomes, so internalizing and externalizing problems. And then I'm going to look at 3 measures of children's cognitive outcomes. So their reading comprehension, their math comprehension, and their verbal ability. So sort of 5 measures of well-being overall. I'm going to measure exposure to paternal incarceration, so any incarceration that had happened in the kid's life, essentially, so between the ages of 1 and 9. Again, about a third of children experience paternal incarceration during this time. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at essentially children's risk for experiencing paternal incarceration. And here what I'm doing is I'm going to measure about 60 different characteristics related to their family life that sort of go into one propensity score, if you're sort of familiar with those methods. But essentially, it's just measuring children's risk for experiencing paternal incarceration based on things like family background and their neighborhood and parental substance abuse and all sorts of things related to the family. And all of those things are going to be measured prior to the measure of paternal incarceration. So sort of to answer the first research question, how does the relationship between paternal incarceration and children's well-being vary by children's risk of experiencing paternal incarceration? So to kind of operationalize risk, I'm going to generate a propensity score based on all of those background characteristics, so those 60-ish background characteristics. And every kid in the sample gets a propensity score, and it's going to range from 0 to 1. And so kids who have a really high risk of experiencing paternal incarceration are going to have a propensity score closer to 1, right? They're going to be more likely to experience paternal incarceration. And children who have a relatively low risk of experiencing paternal incarceration will have a propensity score close to 0, right? So it's going to range between 0 and 1, or actually 0 and 0.8. That's the highest, right? And so the higher your propensity score, the more likely you are to experience paternal incarceration based on kind of what we know about everything else about you, right? And I'm going to group the children into 3 different strata, basically, and what I'm calling them the low-risk group, the moderate-risk group, and the high-risk group. So they're about, sort of equally, so sort of 3 groups of about equal size. And then I'm going to estimate sort of within each group, within the low-risk group, essentially what's the association between paternal incarceration and children's well-being. In the moderate-risk group, what's the association? And in the high-risk group, what's the association? And then I'll look at differences across those groups. So to just give you a sense, before I kind of delve into the main results, I want to give you a sense of what each of those 3 groups look like. I'm presenting here just some background characteristics. This is just a handful of them. Just to show you exactly when I'm talking about low risk, when I'm talking about moderate risk, when I'm talking about high risk, kind of what they're looking like here. And so we see in the low risk group, about 21% of children have non-Hispanic Black mothers. In the moderate risk group, it's about 58%. And in the high-risk group, it's about 72%. So that's consistent with what we know about risk of incarceration more generally, right? Those are first figures I presented. We know that children in the low-risk group are going to have mothers who are slightly older at first birth. So they're going to have their kids at slightly older ages. They're going to be more likely to have lived with both parents at age 15. Mothers in the low-risk group will be less likely to have less than a high school diploma, so they're going to be more highly educated. They're going to be less likely to be living in poverty, less likely to be living with the child's father, less likely to be depressed, less likely to have the child's father report that the child's father engaged in domestic violence, less likely to report that the father has a substance abuse problem. Fathers will have fewer impulsive behaviors, higher cognitive ability, and they're going to be much less likely to be previously incarcerated. Right? So we know that prior incarceration is a strong predictor of future incarceration. So sort of to sum up, right? So we've got this low-risk group that are essentially more advantaged. They have background characteristics, family lives that are more advantaged than the moderate risk group or the high-risk group. And the high-risk group has family sort of background characteristics that are sort of more disadvantaged. But I want to draw your attention to one really important thing, sort of as we're thinking through, as I'm going to present the rest of the results, is that this poverty, so this is not an advantaged sample. So I'm talking about a low-risk group, right? But they're not that low risk because of the nature of the sample. So they're essentially low risk among a really disadvantaged sample, right? So this is not a sample of, white, wealthy, suburban kids, right? This is sort of, and I think it's really most evident if you look at the poverty rate. So in the low-risk group, 21% of children are living in poverty, which is about sort of our national average. But this is not a super advantaged group. So I want to kind of keep that in mind as I present the rest of the results. So moving forward, I'm going to present results from these propensity score, these matching models, essentially, that estimate children's behavioral outcomes. So here I'm presenting results from internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And to sort of orient yourself to these figures here, we've got, so I've standardized all of the outcome variables to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And you can see here that this is for the low risk group, and this is sort of after matching and essentially accounting for all of these background characteristics, right, of children and their parents, because we just want to account for all of those characteristics. And so here we see that children in the low-risk group, children with incarcerated fathers, those who experience incarceration between ages 1 and 9, have about a third of a standard deviation higher internalizing behavioral problems than children who don't experience paternal incarceration, right? They also have higher externalizing behavioral problems, and that translates to about 2/5 of a standard deviation. So it's pretty large. It's a pretty large effect, if you will. When we look at children in the moderate risk group, we see differences, and we see that there's still an effect, there's still an association between paternal incarceration and children's internalizing and externalizing behaviors, but it's smaller, right? It's smaller in magnitude. And then when we look at the high-risk group, again, we still see that children with incarcerated fathers have more internalizing behaviors and more externalizing behaviors than their counterparts without incarcerated fathers. But again, the magnitude of the difference is smaller. This right here is statistically significant, although the coefficient for internalizing problems is not significant, right? So basically, for externalizing problems and externalizing behaviors, we see that paternal incarceration affects all children, right? But that the magnitude of how much it affects children is really contingent on the risk that they fall in, right? And the pattern is really quite similar for internalizing behaviors as well. Now we're going to turn to looking at children's cognitive outcomes. So again, there's 3 measures: reading comprehension, math comprehension, and verbal ability. And here we've got, so lower scores indicate sort of worse outcomes, right? So that's why everything's flipped. And so here if we look at, so again, these are standardized, these outcome variables are standardized. And if we look at, the low risk group, we see that children of incarcerated fathers generally have about a third of a standard deviation lower test scores than children without incarcerated fathers. If we look at the moderate risk group, we see some associations, but they're much smaller in magnitude. And if we look at the high-risk group, we don't see any statistically significant associations, and we see that there are the coefficients go in the expected direction, the way we would expect them to go, but that they're not statistically significant. In both slides, the prior slide and this slide, I should say that the differences across these groups are statistically significant, right? So the differences across, so these are statistically significant differences across groups. So to sort of summarize, we see essentially that the risks, or we know that children have different risks of experiencing paternal incarceration. And for some outcomes, we see that, paternal incarceration has implications for children regardless of risk. But for all outcomes, we see that the associations are strongest among children sort of who have the lowest risk of exposure to paternal incarceration. So that, and I should say one that I didn't present for time, but it's really pretty interesting. If you look at sort of only looking at sort of the whole sample together, and if you were to pool everything together, you see that you wouldn't even see any association between paternal incarceration and children's outcomes, right? And so it's not only until you look at this variation and this heterogeneity that you start to see, oh wow, there is actually an association for some groups of kids, right? And so really what I think, sort of more broadly, we need to be thinking about which kids are most affected by paternal incarceration. And there's lots of different ways to look at that, and this is just one way of looking at it. But if we look at sort of only the average effect, it's going to mask some important differences across groups. So then I sort of said, well, I really want to understand what explains the relationship between paternal incarceration and children's outcomes. So I sort of presented this figure earlier, and I'm thinking that there's at least 4 possibilities for why we might see a sort of deleterious consequences for children. These sort of 4 pathways, and it may be, so one sort of theory that I had was I thought, well, maybe it's going to be that, so among the lower risk group, again, it's still a really disadvantaged group, but among this lower risk group, it may be that the reductions in family income are going to be the most striking, right? So, and that might sort of in turn then cause these children to have worse outcomes. It may be that among these couples, the relationship strains are most challenging, right? Because they're the couples who are going to probably be more likely to be in a relationship to begin with, right? It may be that parenting takes the worst hit, et cetera, among the low risk group. And so that sort of motivated the second research question here. And I won't go through all of this, but essentially what I do is I look at differences in each of these 4 categories to see if what's the implications of incarceration for each of these 4 sort of groups. What do we know, how does incarceration sort of reduce family income, contribute to relationship strains, impede parenting, or impede parental mental health among each of these 3 groups. And so I'm just going to present a couple of highlights from some of that today. So I want to show you, so here, sort of again to kind of orient, these are some descriptive findings, some descriptive results, just to kind of get us one little step closer to understanding what's going on here. And sort of to orient yourself to the next set of figures that I'm going to present. So remember that paternal incarceration is going to be measured between when kids are between the ages of 1 and 9. And so here what I'm doing is I'm just measuring descriptively in particular. So I'm just going to show you what poverty looks like when children are 9 years old, right? So after paternal incarceration, what percentage of children in both the treatment group, so kids who have experienced paternal incarceration, and then the control group, kids who haven't experienced paternal incarceration, what percentage of them have been exposed to poverty or are currently living in poverty at the age of 9, right? So after incarceration. So in the low-risk group, you see that about 30% of kids who experience paternal incarceration are in poverty, and about 18% of kids who have not experienced paternal incarceration are living in poverty. So you sort of see that there's a difference there, which is exactly what we would expect, right? That there's this gap, but we would expect that paternal incarceration would be more consequential, would be related to poverty. If you look at the moderate risk group, of course, because they're moderate risk, right, they're going to have higher levels of poverty to begin with. But you see that the difference between, and it's a little bit less, it's hard to tell on this figure, but I think it'll be more clear with the other figures. The difference, the percentage difference is smaller here. The difference between the paternal incarceration group and the no paternal incarceration group is smaller here than it is for this low risk group. And then you see for the high risk group, really paternal incarceration has no effect on poverty, right? So that's kind of because so many of those kids are already being exposed to poverty, right? So it's not that that these children aren't poor, it's just that paternal incarceration isn't having an added sort of effect on them, controlling for so many other things. I'm going to just present 3 more figures here. So that was poverty. I'm going to show you parental separation. So this is just parental separation when children are 9 years old. Again, if you look at the difference if you look at the low risk group, you see there's quite a big difference between children who are exposed to paternal incarceration and children who aren't. If you look at the moderate risk group, again, the average is higher, but the difference between the groups is smaller. And if you look at the high risk group, again, the difference between the groups is smaller, right? So again, we can kind of conclude, just by looking at these descriptives, we can conclude that incarceration is having the sort of largest effect on the low risk group, which might explain why we see sort of such strong associations for children. This here just presents a measure of shared responsibility in parenting. So it's just a measure of how parents cooperate together, essentially, and co-parent. And again, here we've got, so higher in this case indicates more favorable, right? We know that's associated with children's well-being. And we can see that the differences, again, between the low risk, the differences are largest in the low risk group compared to the moderate risk group and the high risk group. And then finally, looking at maternal depression, again, you see that the differences are largest in the low risk group compared to the moderate or the high risk group, right? So sort of taking all of these descriptive findings together, we see that essentially, we see that incarceration has implications for kids, right, for children, as I showed you earlier, but it also has these sort of cascading implications for family life more generally in terms of economic well-being, in terms of the parental relationship, in terms of parenting and parental mental health, which then sort of contribute, sort of further cascade and contribute to sort of to influence children's well-being. So to summarize these results sort of in total, a couple of takeaways I want you to have. So first, we know that paternal incarceration is especially consequential for children who are least likely to experience paternal incarceration. Again, among this really disadvantaged sample, so that's always something to keep in mind. This suggests that for these families, incarceration is an event stressor that has really cascading implications for family life, which then sort of proliferate to affect children. We see that among that low-risk group, they have the largest post-incarceration differences in those mechanisms, so the figures I just showed you, right, those 4 figures. We also, so again, we see that paternal incarceration is less consequential for children who are most likely to experience paternal incarceration. I want to just draw your attention to the fact that it is still consequential for this group, at least across some of the outcomes. Not all of them, but some of them. And so it's not that it doesn't matter, it's just that it matters less, right? And there's a couple of reasons to think about why. So, why might this be? Why do we see smaller associations in the high-risk group? And one reason, which is probably something that you're all thinking about, is this idea of social selection, right? So for children who are in that really high-risk group, they have so many other disadvantages in their lives, right? They're oftentimes living in poverty, they're living in poor neighborhoods, they're being exposed to violence and all sorts of other things. And so if you really think about it from a causal perspective, which this approach is trying to do, it's not perfect. There's still, for those of you who are sort of statistically savvy, right, where there's still unobservables going on here. So it's not. I don't want to say that it's a causal relationship, but it's trying to get pretty close, right? And so it may be that there's all these other factors for this group that matter, and so adding incarceration into the mix above and beyond all of these other things is just not, that's why we see smaller associations. It may also be that children stop accumulating adverse consequences once they hit a certain point of saturation, right? So once they have so many other disadvantages, again, it may not be sort of incarceration may not have an added effect of all of these other things. Incarceration may offer relief from other stressors, like domestic violence, potentially, or substance abusing parents, right? So the removal, for some children, the removal of a father from the home may offer relief for them and for their caregivers and parents. And it may be that there are, within this sort of high-risk group, it's possible that there are some positive and negative effects, such as the relief from other stressors in conjunction with, say, economic hardship that might offset one another a little bit as well. So thinking about policy and sort of moving this toward policy, I want to say that I think this work and other work really needs to consider sort of this literature more generally really needs to consider heterogeneity in the effects of incarceration. I don't think it is reasonable or plausible to assume that all children are going to be affected by paternal incarceration in the same way. And so just sort of thinking back to children who have so essentially there may be different policy interventions for different groups. Children who have relatively low risks of experiencing paternal incarceration may benefit from reductions in incarceration rates. They may, thinking about relying on criminal justice interventions other than incarceration for low-level offenders might be beneficial for this group. And because the mechanisms linking paternal incarceration and children's well-being really stem from the family, they may children in this group may benefit from family interventions to improve the parental relationship or increase cooperation and support among children's caregivers. So sort of targeting some of those, so we could think about reducing incarceration rates as well as targeting some of those mechanisms at the family level to improve well-being among children. And then for children who are at really high risk of exposure to paternal incarceration, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is an extremely, extremely disadvantaged group. So thinking about the fact that for some outcomes, the incarceration of a parent is not contributing sort of any added effect on their well-being suggests that there's so many other things going on in their lives. And it's really important to keep in mind sort of the nature of the disadvantages that these children are experiencing. Here, because we do see some association, it may be also that alternatives to incarceration may improve children's well-being for this group as well. But policy may also want to focusing on issues that disproportionately affect these children, such as poverty, substance abuse among their parents, and domestic violence, right? And so thinking about interventions that target some of these things that sort of most affect this group may be helpful to children, because it's likely that these are also these factors have implications for children. So to sum, I think the consequences of paternal incarceration are really quite complicated, and I think we're just beginning to understand how complicated they are. I think more generally, research on inequality among children should focus on, we always are focused, researchers are really, really focused on selection, right? And selection into incarceration and selection into other sorts of social problems like poverty or substance abuse. But it's also important to think about sort of how those factors that sort of select people into incarceration may also contribute to their responses to incarceration. And to take it back, we know that incarceration is concentrated among the most disadvantaged subgroups of the population, sort of those figures I presented really early on in the talk. We know that. So it's likely that incarceration increases inequality among all children, but may especially increase inequality, incarceration in particular, may especially increase inequality among children for whom incarceration is unanticipated. So with that, I will close and I will welcome your questions.
Thanks. So we have around slightly over 15 minutes. I'm going to take the prerogative to start with one question and then open it up.
Oh, geez.
Won't be about selection or statistics. Don't worry.